Hello everybody. In this video we're going to take a closer look at the open economy loanable funds model, and we're going to get some insight and also some applications. So let's start off with the closed economy. Recall that the loanable funds model has on its horizontal axis savings and investment, and it's on its vertical axis the real interest rate. This upward sloping blue line tells us saving increases when the interest rate increases. Why? Because an increase in the interest rate is a reward for more savings, whereas investment on this downward sloping blue line, the message here is that when the interest rate falls, the cost of capital falls, capital becomes cheaper, and so firms will invest, they will make more expenditures on capital formation. Now, let's start off with a hypothetical situation. If the country was in fact closed to world capital flows, if it wasn't participating in world capital markets, the interest rate would be determined where the savings function, the upward green line, and the investment function, the downward blue line, intersect. So this red line tells us the hypothetical autarky rate of interest that equates savings and investment. So autarky is the one that would prevail under a closed or autarkic solution. But this was just a hypothetical. In reality, this economy and most economies, financial markets, are open, which means that capital can flow in or out. That means that this small open economy, which we're assuming, this country faces an external rate of interest, one that is determined externally, and it's determined in world capital markets, and you'll note that this interest rate is lower than the autarky rate. Compared to an autarky situation, the country saves less, but it also invests more, and that means that with open capital markets, its investment is going to be greater than savings. Now let's recall some basic identities. You'll recall that output is equal to the sum of consumption expenditures plus investment expenditures plus government expenditures plus exports minus imports, and this last term we often call net exports, and sometimes we also call it the trade balance. Now we're going to make a little simplification. It's not exactly true, but it's almost true, and it's true enough for this, that a country's output exactly equals its income. This is not strictly true because in the open economy there are some elements of income. For example, transfer from abroad would be something that a country doesn't produce, but it would be part of their disposable income. And also, let's say that the country was receiving some payments from investments that it had made. And in that case, there would be a difference between the country's income and the country's output. But we're not going to consider that. Instead, the country's income / output we'll think of as being spent on consumption plus private savings plus taxes. So if we do one more thing, that we define public savings as taxes minus government expenditures, we often call this the government budget surplus. Once you can verify that if we put these two equations and solve out, we get an equation that private savings plus public savings, total domestic savings minus investment, is equal to exports minus imports. So we often say that the savings investment balance by definition is equal to the difference between exports and imports. The savings investment balance in this simple model are equal to net exports. But there's another interpretation for net exports. Net exports are also the excess of income / output over consumption plus investment plus government expenditures. If we have exports minus imports less than zero, deficit on net exports, that's equivalent to saying that our savings is less than our investment, or alternatively, that our income is less than our expenditures. If we have a surplus on net exports, that's equivalent to saying that our savings, our domestic savings, is greater than our investment, or that our output is greater than our expenditures. So all of this describes a country's external balance from the standpoint of decisions that are made by market participants in the country. But there's another side to this, and that's financing. Because if we spend more than we earn, then someone has to finance those expenditures. And if we are earning more than we're spending, then we're financing some expenditures for someone else. So let's think of this deficit case, because we're going to be focusing on that. Any way we slice this deficit, and foreigners will have to agree to provide financing for us. We're thinking of this, that this country is a willing borrower, and foreigners are willing lender. And we also call this a net capital inflow. On the other direction, if we're a surplus country, that means that we are providing financing for foreigners, and we call that a net capital outflow. We've agreed to provide financing. The question is at what interest rate, because the interest rate we would have to interpret as for the standpoint of financing is a kind of compensation. If I finance you, if I loan you some money, I expect to be paid some interest. So we're going to keep that question in mind. At this current interest rate, the country is running a deficit. And we just saw that we can interpret that as a deficit on net exports, or we can also call that the difference between savings and investment. Savings in this case will be less than investment. And foreigners have agreed to provide this financing at the interest rate stated. Next, we're going to review the concept of the real exchange rate. This is just to remind you, we define E as foreign currency units per domestic currency unit. For example, if we're in Costa Rica, we define E as, let's say, US dollars per Costa Rican peso. This means that an increase in E we consider to be a real appreciation, a more valuable currency. This is going to encourage imports. Why? Imports will become cheaper when the currency appreciates. This is going to discourage exports. Why? Because they're going to become less attractive to produce. Why is that? Let's say that you're an exporter and you're receiving dollars and you want to purchase Costa Rican pesos. So when Costa Rican pesos become more valuable, it becomes less attractive for you to be exporting. In the other direction, a decrease in E is a real depreciation, and this is going to discourage imports because they become more expensive when the currency depreciates, but it's also going to encourage exports. Now exporters will be receiving more Costa Rican pesos for each dollar. Each dollar is more valuable relative to the Costa Rican peso. So that's why we can summarize net exports and real exchange rate with this downward sloping blue line. Net exports on the horizontal axis, you'll notice we have a deficit here, and as we move to the right, we move to surplus, and the real exchange rate on the vertical axis, appreciation plus. So as we move up, that means we have a more valuable currency. So again, this downward sloping line means that a real appreciate encourages imports, discourages exports, and hence reduces net exports, whereas a real depreciation, it discourages imports, it encourages exports, and hence increases net exports. But now we're going to put everything together because these are related concepts. So once again, over here, we have the situation with savings minus investment. Investment is determined by the interest rate. Savings is determined by the interest rate. So the savings investment balance for domestic market participants is determined by the real interest rate. But in the background, we also realize that foreigners have agreed to provide that amount of financing at that interest rate. We're going to take this difference, and this will be represented here over here in this diagram by the vertical goal line, the savings investment balance, and you'll notice here that we still have the downward sloping net export schedule. So this gap corresponds to this line. The equilibrium real exchange rate is the one that equates the savings investment balance and slash the financing provided by foreigners, let's call it the net capital inflow in this case, with the trade balance deficit. Let's see why this must be so. Let's start off with a real exchange rate that is overvalued, that it's above its equilibrium value. In this case, the trade balance deficit would be a larger one than foreigners would be willing to finance. People would like to import more, and they're exporting less than the financing that foreigners are providing. So think of importers, they're competing with one another for a fixed supply of foreign currency right here. That's going to drive down the value of the home currency. We call that a depreciation. And as the value of the home currency is declining relative to the foreign currency, imports are going to be decreasing and exports are going to be increased until our savings investment balance is identically equal with net exports. Let's try it from the other direction. Let's suppose that the real exchange rate is undervalued. In this case, the trade balance deficit would be a smaller one than foreigners would be willing to finance. So we're going to be having a lot of exporters who are coming to market with an abundance of foreign currency. They've sold their goods, they've got a lot of foreign currency, they want to trade it for domestic currency. During that process, they're going to be bidding up the value of the domestic currency relative to the foreign currency, and we'll call that an appreciation of the home currency. As this happens, some exporters are going to be squeezed out, but more imports are going to be encouraged until we once again reach this equilibrium where savings and investment financing are equal to net exports. So we've done quite a bit of work. We have pinned down the equilibrium savings investment balance, which is also net exports. Now, once again, this is kind of a simplification. In the real world, the savings investment balance would be equal to what we call the current account, which is net exports plus some other income items, but we're ignoring those income items. But we've also pinned down the real exchange rate. That's quite a bit of work. So now let's do some applications.